Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson, and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. I have over 14 years of collective experience as a registered social worker and 5 years working as a therapist. In this video, I want to just talk about mindset in terms of if you've been the scapegoat in your family, and particularly if you went no contact. And I want to make some reflections on just the way in which the scapegoat is often the strongest person in the family. These roles are manufactured typically by the narcissistic parent, and the terms is splitting, right? So they split the kids because of their own psyches not fully formed. And so these are artificial creations that are placed on the children from a young age. Obviously, each child has a certain disposition or temperament, personality, that there's some sense that obviously there's nurture and nature, right? In some sense, the child, though, with this role that's assigned, it could be the case that if they're the scapegoat, it's maybe they're more of a truth teller and they have some resilience that the other kids don't have. But I guess what I want to talk about too is it's not about the scapegoating being necessarily special. You just come from this narcissistic family. There's a lot of things online saying how it's a unique role. And certainly it's the harshest role just because the family's projecting onto this child and they are told from a very young age that they're at fault. And so it's very much, and the scapegoat is the one that's shining the mirror back to the superego. To take ball and family therapy to the undifferentiated collective ego mass. Because the narcissistic family is based largely on the narcissistic parent or parents, the narcissistic parent has their false self. The siblings typically are just an extension of that false. But the scapegoat is more honored to themselves as an individual and to perhaps the collective unconscious, to what Carl Jung might say, the depths of the psyche. And it could also be the case because they were blamed and there's so much chaos maybe in the home that they turn inward. There's the sense that they're often very reflective and very sensitive because they had to walk on eggshells from a young age. They had to predict how the mom and dad were going to react. They were aware of the shadow of the parent. And there's also the notion of there's the empath, and so maybe later in life in romantic relationships, and you attract to a more of a narcissistic person. The empath, where they fall in terms of their shadow, it can be naive, and they likely see the potential in people. Whereas the narcissist, it's more just about getting supply and zapping the energy, introducing death to that target. But the naive, sensitive person that maybe was scapegoat in the family, not necessarily, but if that adult grows up as an empath, then there's a notion of repetition compulsion. So that's just to take Freud, that the scapegoat wants there to be this sense of love and that they never really got when they were younger. Subconsciously, they seek that in another. And also the empath might see the potential of people. And that's where maybe they have a gift, but they can be naive and taken advantage of by the narcissist. But in this video, I also want to just talk about how I think from a young age, usually you have some of this understanding of yourself. And so it's tricky, right? Because you're in this shared fantasy from a very young age. And because you're projected upon and just because the child internalizes, typically the child, it's too painful for them to accept that their parents or their family doesn't love them, or that it's not a mutually loving family, but rather a more controlling environment. So they suppress this right from a young age because it's too painful. And because only ourselves ultimately are able to take responsibility, the child, especially if they're more of an internalizer, they tend to take it on their own shoulders. And also the families, because of the scapegoating role, are quick and open to doing that to the scapegoat. There's this notion growing up that despite what the scapegoat does, they are blamed, ashamed, put down, bullied, and never recognized, it's never acknowledged. When they speak up, psychological or emotional abuse occurs more strongly. They're the containers of the shadow, but they can never speak out about the shadow. And so this is just to understand what's going on. But then from a young age too, you might have turned maybe to spirituality or just to like self-help books, seeking an answer and trying to figure out why there's chaos in your family environment or why you continue this repetition compulsion as an adult. And you never actually come to terms with why you attract these people in your life. There's a pseudo mutuality. You're the one that's giving, and yet people are often taking from you. Of course, maybe you have some friends that don't do that, but it's you attract these dynamics and put up with it because subconsciously that was what you were used to. Dr. Phil says that we teach people how to treat us. And Carl Jung also said that what we take as destiny is our psyche projecting. And so until we address this repetition compulsion, and really that often comes down to self-healing and self-love. I could talk about reparenting and other aspects in terms of being a loving, caring parent to yourself. And that's certainly some of it. There's a notion of inner bonding therapy. So that's just to know that intellectually you can go to a therapist and also do a lot of reading and research, but there's also a point to have a certain subconscious and more of emotional discussion with the notion of an inner child, because you could be walking around the world having very much an adult part of yourself, like a manager part to take IFS therapy. But then there's this child part that is continuing to seek out. And there's also this notion of an abandoned child or an estranged child or a forgotten child or like an orphaned archetype. Having that discussion to the self, to the child part that might be in this corner or been ignored for so many years, you're talking to it and maybe doing a visualization. Maybe you imagine going back to your room in your house growing up and maybe what that child was experiencing. And what sort of the notion of procedural logic. So that's just to take internal family systems again. It's the notion that from a developing mind of a child, depending on the age, I remember I was very scared at night and I would go to my room and I didn't think anyone liked me, or I wanted really to belong, but I could never belong. If you grow up in this home where it's never safe, the psyche also gets split and the ego takes on the collective shadow of the family, and yet protects this more innocent part of the self. The same way that the narcissist is a false self, the scapegoat grows up believing this projection of this shadow from the family as who they are. It's unliving that and unbelieving that and working on that. But that goes back to this notion of procedural logic. Mom and dad are always arguing, therefore it's not safe, I must go to my room, or people don't get along. It's just a very simple logic, and you have to imagine that you have these more simple narratives, and that's to just go into schema therapy, is just to examine some of these schemas or these limited beliefs that no longer serve, but having empathy for that child part that is perhaps have been exiled, and so it's about reintegrating that part of yourself. And that's also, again, to take internal family system, that there's no bad part. But I also wanted to mention how you have, probably from a young age, this realization that you knew you had a lot of potential and gifts, a certain sensitivity. You probably knew you had the strength. And it's probably the case also that the narcissistic parent also knew this, because it could be the case that the narcissistic parent has extended this to their offspring, but for whatever reason, as the scapegoat, you didn't mirror back at them. The parents had this hall of mirrors and the emotional fusion with the kids, and your siblings were pitted against you, and there was never a feedback loop or never acknowledgement of the truth except for your own inner psyche. You probably have been gaslit and also gaslit yourself. So there's usually a lot of self-doubt because you have the weight of your parents and your family and the worry and fear that you could be left behind or ostracized. If your parent is more of a communal narcissist, they've convinced others that they're this upstanding individual in the community, or they have other people around them like flying monkeys or a certain reputation, even like a job. They give the illusion that they are this upstanding individual, but then like Jekyll and Hyde, right? In the family home, they can be very cold, they're very neglectful. But then again, going back to the scapegoat child, they perhaps developed this sensitivity from a young age. They introspected quite a bit. which is a gift and a curse because they probably were more of an internalizer. So they would take the weight on of the family, and they weren't typically making a discernment between what is their own and what is not their own. And that is, I think, just to understand, like Jay Reed, he talks about having these 3 stages. So you first understand the map of the narcissistic family or the narcissist. Then you get free and get safe. So you limit contact or go no contact. And there is a lot of evidence that limiting or going no contact really is needed to address these and heal from these aspects, because it's likely the case that you have complex trauma. And each time you're going back to the narcissistic abuse cycle and the intermittent reinforcement and this notion of this healing fantasy that you might have, that, and the narcissists probably have all these different defense mechanisms to hoover you back in. In that process, your body and your mind is being exposed to this narcissist or even perhaps psychopathic aspects in the family. Especially when you go no contact and limit contact, the family is probably more suspicious of you and more likely to be smearing your name. They are much more apprehensive and hostile towards you. It's just to understand that, going back to Jay Reed, it's just that there's these stages, and so it's getting clear and of who the narcissist is and really believing and understanding it. Then it's getting safe, and obviously you do that in both at the same time in some sense, because I think getting safe is number one. And then the third aspect is just to live in defiance of the narcissist, and that's to assert yourself and differentiate. And you can also take Carl Jung as like you are going in the depths of your interior world and just paying attention to your interior world and honoring it. And this could be simple things as journaling. It could be active imagination, is just to allow your mind to associate to certain mythology, or it could be symbolism, paying attention to your dreams and trying to harvest if there's any insight in terms of that. And it could be reading certain books and literature. And like for me, I like philosophy, right? So I think philosophy and psychology, reading those texts can really anchor yourself in a more like ideas that have existed throughout time. And so you connect yourself to this collective unconscious and to the collective. There's a notion of the noosphere. We have the physiosphere, the ecosphere, and then the biosphere, and then we have the noosphere. And that's to understand that mind is in itself a sphere. There's a felt sense to the interior of the world. But because we live in a very materialistic and often reductionist scientism, and there's all this notion that the inner world is just made up of the brain and it's just a product of the brain, and yet we have rich art and all this interior of ourselves. But often in these families, the narcissist is convinced that the world is this superficial, surface level. It's all about status. It's all about what they're going to get out of things. It's usually very hedonistic and very much about not honoring this inner world. They keep things very superficial, and your parent likely doesn't want to have that depth to it because that's fearful for the false self. From a young age, you probably knew, in some sense, you had this intuition that something was off. And yet, because you needed to survive in that dynamic, you suppressed it, probably just went on with your life. But maybe it's until later in your life that you look back and you see these threads. It's kind of like living in the Twilight Zone or the Truman Show. You wake up and it's this kind of uncanny valley. You're in this place that you never expected you would be, and you make connections to your past. You had those experiences and those memories, but then you ascribed certain meaning to it in a different way because you realized the narcissistic parents were very much self-seeking and transactional. You were just an extension of them. Those experiences that you thought you had that mutual relationship with, you probably largely didn't. Some parents are less narcissistic, and so there are some good times. I've had clients where they've said that even if their parents are narcissistic, that there was still a sense of love. And I guess in some sense, obviously, your family's always going to be like your family. And so at a core, like a primordial level, maybe there is this sense of love. But then it's tricky because it's like, obviously, a narcissistic parent doesn't, like if they really truly loved and cared about you, they obviously wouldn't have mistreated you. But that's a way in life making that distinction. It's probably reflecting on your past experiences And it could be helpful to process that with a therapist more specialized in this area because it's a journey feel very confusing and just lonely. You've had this sense that other people have had these experiences in their family and they've always felt connected, whereas you never did. And you always probably thought it was yourself or something inherently wrong with you. To go back to the scapegoating role, you have this deep embedded insecurity. You thought you were the only one because in the family, there's a perception that everyone else is together and they projected their shadow onto the scapegoat. Because the scapegoat could have a neurosis or some sort of mental health because of that, it definitely gets expressed as though that child is or the adult is the one that has the issues. But it's like you try to have real conversations and address these things. And I guess over time as an adult, you probably start to also pick up on that. How could it always be my fault? There's usually anger, but also like a sense of, you probably can have a sense of humor around this too, because it's like at a certain point you just laugh at it because it's, how ridiculous is like, you see how ridiculous some of it is just in terms of what you're being blamed for or what certain siblings say. I think that's a healthy way because humor is a way that you're able to objectify things and you're speaking to the truth. You would only be able to really laugh at things if you transcended it and saw through it. So the ability to laugh at it, to look at it. But yeah, I guess I just in this video also want to just describe how from a young age, you probably had this intuition. You probably knew that your sister has this anger issue, or you probably knew, okay, why does my parent never show up for me? Or you maybe have these memories where they left you and didn't return. It's interesting because sometimes you might have brought that up with your family and they might have made that out to be a joke. I talked about this in another video. Their memory is usually off. They use memory more as like a notion of a highlight reel. So it's mostly to do with elevating their own ego and self. It's not usually accurate. If you raise any concerns or bad memories or things that happened, there's a tendency for them to convert that into and dismiss them. But it's okay, I was there, I had this memory. How could it be the case that they don't see this? But I think, yeah, doing a good assessment of your past, maybe picking out some key memories could be helpful to process them with a therapist so you re-own them. Jordan Peterson, he's a clinical psychologist. He is at the U of T here, used to be a professor there, and he's very much famous now. But he has this notion that if you have a memory that's more than 2 years and you think you're still thinking about it, then it's certainly the case that you need to continue, like you need to process it, because if your mind continues to have these thoughts and emotions, they obviously haven't been processed. So it's just something to think about, as if you've had a memory, an experience, maybe like in your nightmares or dreams that repeat, and it's been more than 2 years. It could be childhood experiences. Then I think it could be helpful to, let's say you had a top 5 or 10 and you first journal about them, and then it can go back to these just experiences of the way you were treated and process those with a therapist or with a close friend. Typically be better to be a professional. Some people are using AI to do this, and I think there's a place for that, but obviously having another professional or human being to help you process this is ideal. Then you could also think about going back again to this internal family system. So just this notion that you maybe have these different parts of the self. So you could have a 4-year-old or an 8-year-old. Let's say your parents got divorced at 12, and it could be the case that you suppress that 12-year-old. And then you can ask yourself, maybe when you're in your romantic relationship and your partner says something to you, it's like this 12-year-old gets activated in internal family systems. That could be like an exile part, some part that you pushed away or suppressed from a young age, but then can become active and can somewhat, control the self, and you blend with that part. And so instead of just acting from your anger, this could be like this 12-year-old part that doesn't want to be abandoned, or so it goes in hypervigilant mode. So anyway, you can reflect on the memories and think about internal family systems and the notion of internal logic, basic logic that a child would be thinking at that age, and considering that logic and just doing somewhat of maybe a ritual to know that you don't have to hold on to that anymore. And again, in this video, I don't want to, it's too much to maybe go into all how to do that exactly. It's just to understand these aspects and how the mind of a child that becomes an adult in narcissistic or dysfunctional families, they suppress and they also likely internalize There's obviously been this relationship trauma from a young age. So then that shows up in your own family, your romantic relationships, or even in your friendship. And then if it's not resolved, and there's the notion of a lack of differentiation. So maybe you're projecting or being overly reactive towards some experience, or you're in this repetition compulsion where you continue to attract or allow people to treat you a certain way. In this video, I want to talk about aspects and reflections on these younger parts of ourselves and these memories, how to process them, how to think about them, how you can explore this by first journaling about them and then processing them with a therapist. And if they've been more than 2 years old in terms of memories that you have, that's usually a sign that you haven't fully processed. Thanks and have a great day.